welcome back. So the name of the game, you have stats, everyone has stats, and everyone has a dedicated Boon or Bane, or maybe none whatsoever. However, when it comes to just choosing optimal IVs, quote unquote, there is a lot to consider, and I always found that a lot of people still struggle to at least choose a proper Boon, or not necessarily struggle, but they tend to debate based on whether or not they want one Boon over the other. So I figured I'd make this video discussing the benefits to taking a Boon and Bane in each respective stat, pretty much stuff you could generally consider whenever you need to build a unit, or if you need to choose between an IV or two. So with that in mind, we're going to be going over Boons and Banes for HP, attack, speed, defense, and res. I'll list some notable highlights for pretty much each of these respective stats, and whether or not they're worth dumping in most cases. So with that out of the way, we may as well just get started talking about HP. So HP for the most part is definitely more supportive based. There aren't really a lot of skills that scale off HP per se, unless it's having a lower amount of HP, whether that's like a brazen or a desperation effect, as a lot of HP skills are generally based on having more present HP over the foe, whether that's panic or pulse tie, you name it. You also have cases where infantry pulse can be used to support your own allies as well. But outside of that, HP skills are really like boost skills, which don't really do anything. But even with that being the case, supporting units with HP based skills is actually relatively cheap because you just need HP plus 5 in your A slot and Sacred Seal. And then although it's a bit more premium, you can just run a better B slot or C slot. It's definitely way more approachable than the likes of like any other super high investment unit. But again, this is heavily supportive based, so you aren't going to really see it much for combat purposes. However, there are boons to just taking the HP boon, whether that's, again, inflicting panic with the likes of sudden panic, giving infantry pulse support to your allies, or running pulse tie, whether that's odd pulse tie and 8th raise defense, so you can shut down stuff like Hardy Fighter, which grants -2 cooldown to any defensive special at the start of turn 1. You could reset that if the unit's HP is a bit higher, or you can run even pulse tie on 8th raise offense, or summoner duels if you're looking to shut down readily active specials, which is really nice. Realistically, you could put this on like a lot of units, but for the most part, any unit that generally focuses on supportive capabilities, you can ignore Garrick. I just put him here because he has a lot of HP and he comes with sudden panic and infantry pulse anyway. Taking the HP boon is definitely worthwhile. However, there are also a lot of benefits to taking an HP Bane, as well as some drawbacks. So as I mentioned, pulse ties can shut down any sort of instant special on any sort of unit that has lower HP than that current unit. However, if your HP is lower as a result, then you could always be affected by it. But that being said, you could always run another unit with even lower HP, and then they would be able to soak it instead, which is really convenient in that regard. Definitely the biggest benefit to taking an HP Bane is definitely setting up Gale Force strategies with the likes of Double Fury or even Triple Fury, depending on the set you use, as well as Desperation for even PvE scenarios, or in some cases Aether Raids or Summoner Duels, depending on what you generally use it in. There is also the benefit of being able to get Infantry Pulse, so if you were to use something like Valoria or Brune Raphael, then charging stuff like Blazing Winds or Instant Lethalities is going to be really, really easy to do, so you could always go in turn 1 with a Yuri with Instant Lethality and pretty much wreak havoc. It's really cool in that regard. Although it's a bit more nerfed nowadays because, you know, you have Ymir on Aether Raid's defense, but regardless, it's still something that you can do. But with lower HP means that you're more susceptible to stuff like HP-based panic, whether that's sudden panic or panic ploy, although the former is definitely a lot more common, I guess, at least on a Versa or any sort of like high HP dancer. But also because you're basically chipping away at your HP, you're definitely way more susceptible to damage, because something that you could have otherwise tanked with maybe like an Res Bane and some other boon, you're basically decreasing your defense and res simultaneously by decreasing your HP. So in that regard, you will more than likely get one shot in retaliation or take a lot of damage to the point where your survivability is a lot more slim. But generally, this is used for Gale Force strategies, as with Double Fury or even Triple Fury, you can fall below 50% HP within 2 or 3 combats, give or take, and then you can act as a Wings of Mercy beacon, which is really convenient. So in that regard, if you are looking to take any sort of HP boon or bane, these are the things you would want to consider. Next, we have the attack stat, which is pretty self-explanatory. The more attack you have, the more damage you do. It's a very important stat, especially for the likes of cavalry and flyers, if they need to make heavy blade checks because they don't have access to flashing blade. Generally, for the most part, it's pretty self-explanatory. You deal more damage with more attack. You want more attack if your unit is heavily combat focused. And if you're using a cavalry or flyer, taking the attack boon is definitely way more important than probably a speed boon, because heavy blade checks are just way too hard to make nowadays. So any point of attack that you can get, you should take. But also there are means of using it supportively, as stacking up your visible attack to a significant degree means that you can soak chills and shrines with the likes of chill attack, bright shrine, so on and so forth. But beyond that, you also have area of effect specials, which absolutely require visible attack because the damage you inflict on the foe is prior to that unit's combat, which means it scales off visible stats. So like if you have 60 attack and the foe has 30 defense and you're using an AoE that basically just adds whatever damage minus the foe's defense, then you're getting 30 outside combat damage. So the more you can have visible, the more it stacks up. And if you were to use it with heavier hitting AoEs like blazing specials, then it's going to do even more. And you may be wondering why you would ever want to consider taking an attack Bane if the attack set is that good for pretty much a lot of general stuff. But there are cases where you would want an attack Bane, more so with dancers. Now, dancers for the most part don't really need their attack set because their whole gimmick is supportive capabilities. However, when you put a dancer in the AI's hands, they will potentially attack the foe if they have enough attack to do so. I think it's the 5 damage rule. So in that regard, reducing the amount of attack that you can put on that unit means that they're more likely going to be dancing. However, if they get isolated, then they're going to attack regardless. But even with that being the case, they're dancers with limited BST, so their combat is really, really limited anyway. So generally, if you can take an attack Bane, I would absolutely put it on dancers, especially on the ranged ones, because they're more likely to attack foes as they have a bigger threat range. However, there are also niche cases where you could potentially try to match the attack stat by using fortress skills or like attack Banes or whatever, so that you could get the bonus doubler effect from legendary Eliud. He is due for a remix, so this probably will age quite a bit when he gets it, but this is more so a niche case regardless. And the only reason you'd ever really want to take an attack Bane is so the AI would avoid attacking for whatever reason. And that's pretty much it when it comes to the attack stat. Then we have the speed stat, which is arguably one of the most important or most worthless stats in the game, because for the most part, speed is definitely notable for having the ability to secure double. That's pretty much the point of speed. You want to double and you want to prevent doubles from the foe. That's very important. It can also be used with the likes of a guaranteed follow-up if you want to bypass wary impact effects, such as Coral Saber with Kent, although he's probably better with a Flow and Florid Cane, but regardless, it's something you can take into consideration for the slower units. Not like super slow, but the ones that don't have as much speed, they can still bypass impact effects, which is really, really convenient in that regard. But also you have one of the most noteworthy aspects of stacking speed, and that's damage reduction, whether that's from Spurn, Repel, Close Call, or even Speed Smoke 4 for pretty much any other unit that can't access those skills, or Savvy Fighter for your ranged armors. That's going to be really important for them, especially since they allocate a lot of their stats to their speed stat, meaning that their natural bulk and far safe capabilities are heavily reliant on damage reduction. And akin to the attack stat, you can still use it for soaking. Soak a chill speed, soak a bright shrine, whatever the case may be. And in this regard, that's why speed is really, really important nowadays, even though it's really, really difficult in certain modes to just speed stack because speed creep is just everywhere. To that degree, there's also the fact that it could also be the most worthless stat for many units because they want to prioritize their general tanking capabilities over any sort of natural ability to double, which generally comes in the form of far saves, which heavily rely on guaranteed follow-ups for the most part, as well as having good mixed bulk. So the idea here really is you want to just shrug off as much damage as possible. So even if you are taking 2 attacks, it could potentially be even less damage than if you were taking 1 attack with damage reduction and basically no bulk. But also, given the fact that Deadeye and Lethality and any sort of damage reduction nullification effects are present, any sort of unit that could even be slower, like maybe even a Young Innis versus a Yenfei, if a super stacked Yenfei with like 80 bajillion speed goes up against a +0 Innis with an instant special, then Yenfei is more than likely going to be shredded because he doesn't really have good natural bulk. And that's just another problem more so with the fact that relying on damage reduction is always going to be worse than relying on just visible stats, which is why in that regard, speed can definitely be a bit worthless. But also, any unit with Brave effects, whether that's player phase Brave, enemy phase Brave, or dual phase Brave, the fact that they can attack twice regardless of speed, even though the foe will more than likely be able to double back, the fact that they could get 2 attacks out consecutively means that they don't have to prioritize their speed either. Granted, there are cases where like Laszlo, Finn, cases like that, basically where they can stack speed, so you can potentially quad or avoid as much incoming damage as possible if you aren't using them as vantage units. That can be pretty good. However, for the most part, most units with Brave effects don't really need their speed stat because they're mainly relying on their first 2 attacks, which is really, really important. But also keep in mind that stacking speed can be good if you are looking to reduce the amount of damage reduction the foe gets based on their speed. So that's pretty good in that regard. But generally, Brave effects are going to be outputting a lot more than 1 attack at 100% because it's 2 60% hits versus 1 100% hit, give or take. So yeah, units with Brave don't really need it for the most part, but that's really the extent of it when it comes to just taking the speed Bane. If they don't need their speed set, or it's too low to the point where they can't reliably speed set, it's just not worth taking. In my opinion, saves, dual phase Brave units really don't need their speed for the most part. And then we have the defense stat, which in my opinion is definitely one of the more underrated stats, if that makes sense, because there's only 5. It's just not really discussed as much, but it's arguably one of the more important defensive stats that we have, because regardless of the tanking role that you go into, you're gonna need your defense stat, because foes that target your defense are definitely a lot more common at 1 range, but they're pretty much as common as the ones at 2 range, as opposed to your res stat, which is either magic, staves, or dragons, and then the occasional adaptive unit. So in that regard, defense is actually really useful, but you'll more than likely see it on the likes of melee specialists. But regardless, you still need it for general tanking. Even then though, if your defense is really pitifully low, the best thing you can honestly do is not even attempt to go into a tanking role, because in my opinion, trying to be a ranged specialist with no defense or no damage reduction of any kind is definitely going to be really, really difficult, because you can always go up against units that have Deadeye, lethality, or even with damage reduction that can still pierce through it. So it's a lot more difficult in that regard. And in my opinion, that's also why having a natural defense stat is really, really coveted. As such, if they don't really have a defense stat worth using, especially for ranged tanking, that's probably the best time they could take a Bane, or if they're using a Desperation set or they're using an AoE set, you don't really need your defense stat, because the whole goal is just to output as much damage as possible before the foe can even counterattack, as you're basically dumping your defensive stats willy-nilly like that. And this was definitely one of the more shorter segments, but there really isn't much to say about defense. It is a very important stat for tanking, but that's really about it. It doesn't really provide much else otherwise, whether that's in utility or just damage output, unless you were to use like a Bonfire Ignis. But regardless, there really isn't much to say about defense. But there is a bit more to say about res. So in my opinion, even though res is very important for going up against units like Reinhardt or any sort of high-hitting magical nuke, it's definitely less important in my opinion because of Hardy Fighter Deflect magic combinations, which can basically shrug off any sort of magic damage you would basically otherwise be taking. However, that generally only applies to the likes of armors. And for the most part, any ranged infantry unit that is going into a ranged tanking role will more than likely have a good amount of res as is. If anything, they'll probably have way less defense than they will have res. But regardless, it's still a good defensive stat. I just find that for defense, it's a lot more coveted. But regardless, it's still good to have anyway. Especially since res is a lot more supportive in nature than defense can ever be. At least at the moment. Res-based skills such as sabotages, Dragon Wall. Dragon Wall is not really supportive, but it could be used for your dragons, which is really good. But sabotages can be really, really nice for pretty much just providing support, whether that's with Tamari or whatever the case may be. It's really, really good in that regard. It can also be used for res-based checks, whether that's like Flow Feather or Pegasus Flight. And I forgot to mention this with defense. You can still use the same thing there with like Wyvern Flight. But even with that being the case, it's still a really decent defensive stat that has supportive capabilities. So even if you are using a support unit, you can still stack their res and then provide additional support, which is really, really convenient. However, comparatively to the likes of defense, I find that there is a bit more of a reason to take a res Bane over a defense Bane, and that's more so with the likes of melee specialists and near saves. As with melee specialists and near saves, you're only going to be going up against foes with one range, and most foes target defense. Now granted, res will be important for dragons, but for the most part, near saves, melee specialists are only really going to be going up against units that target their defense. As such, if you had to take any sort of Bane, res is definitely one of the better ones you can take, especially if they can use their speed set to any sort of a significant degree. But if they are mixed like Ball Fist, then you're more than likely better off just keeping that res in check and then just taking the Speed Bane. But regardless, it's not nearly as important as defense for that role specifically. But also akin to the likes of defense, if you are just using a Desperation set or dumping it for AoEs, then there's no reason to have any sort of res. You could really interchange it with defense in that regard because your defensive stats really aren't that important outside of just damaging specials that scale off those stats. So taking a Bane for Desperation isn't the worst. However, I should note, if you were to use Still Water and you have a good res set, you could still bypass through stuff like Dragon Wall, which does have damage reduction against AoE. So if you were using a Reeve, for example, with Stillwater 4 and all that jazz, basically, you would basically be able to shred through a lot of Dragon Wall users, which is really convenient in that regard for AoEs. But outside of that, you can pretty much take the res Bane for any unit that doesn't really have a good res set. And overall, there's a lot of benefits and drawbacks to pretty much taking a Boon and Bane for each of these stats. And it does help that we do have the merge removal thing, where if you merge it up to at least +1, then your Bane is removed. So that's really convenient. But if you did have to choose between Banes and Boons or whatever, you may as well consider whatever I'm listing here because it's something to keep in mind, especially for newer units that are a lot more premium and you're only getting one copy of. But yeah, it's pretty much just food for thought. Let me know what you think down below. Do you agree with any of this? Is there some stuff I missed that's worth noting? Let me know down below. And until next time, I'll see you later.